So how Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a real-life fairy hunter is the video we're doing uh, from Weird History. So we've talked a little bit about his spiritualism already. We talked about that in the previous video that we checked out. So we'll be able to build upon that with this continuing conversation. So let's get started with that because I'm sure a lot of you have to pee. So we're going to take a break when we are done with this part, and then I'll check everything, make sure the stream's healthy, go take a pee-pee, and maybe get a snack. All right, let's get this one started, I suppose. Bam.
If modern movie and TV versions of the world's most famous detective have taught us anything, it's that the popularity of Sherlock Holmes is forever ingrained in our collective pop culture memory. Even Star Trek told tales of Holmes and Watson through the lens of the 24th century. But the man who brought Holmes into the world, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was a bit of a detective in his own right. And in the early 20th century, he became involved in a supernatural investigation of his own that would give Sherlock a run for his money. So, today, we're investigating Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's obsession with the supernatural hoax. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. Oh, and if that weren't enough, leave us a comment and let us know what author-related topics you would like to hear about. Okay, let's get a clue about someone who was kind of clueless. The tale of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the fairies begins with his growing interest in spiritualism. It all began with a strong belief in his nanny's psychic abilities and increased from there. A belief that the dead are able to communicate with the living through some earthly medium, spiritualism became a beacon for Doyle in his later life. He would even spend the last 14 years of his life dedicated to the cause. But there was more to it than that. The sad death of his brother and his son Kingsley in 1918 served as a catalyst for these beliefs. These deaths and a few other factors piqued his curiosity in the subject. So he decided to go into business for himself. Cue the Ghostbusters theme.
Since we are going to be getting into like fairy hunting and ghost hunting, like really in the grand scheme of things, there's nothing more ridiculous about fairy hunting than there is about ghost hunting. Like they're both like, there's no reason why one is more ridiculous than the other. Fairy sounds silly, but depending on what culture you're in, a fairy hunting for fairies might sound way more normal in a place where like maybe fairies are more ingrained in the mythology of a particular place than the popularization of like the ghost narrative.
Armed with a strong sense of spiritualism and his own investigative skills, he took on the curious case of the Cottingley fairies.
Oh God, yeah, this I wasn't sure exactly what this was. This is a really like clearly fake picture. He was very easily tricked by what is basically a primitive form of photoshopping. Spoiler alert.
The story of Doyle's investigation into the Cottingley fairies begins with a popular British magazine called The Strand. In the winter of 1920, the magazine published a curious story with the headline, Fairies Photographed, an epoch-making event described by A. Conan Doyle. Regular readers of the magazine knew Doyle's work well. His Sherlock Holmes stories were often published in the magazine prior to any other publication. This headline probably came as a bit of a shock, to say the least. Whenever readers opened up the brand new issue of Strand featuring Doyle's work, they expected to read the latest Holmes adventure. But instead of a harrowing tale of Holmes versus Moriarty, or the latest Professor Challenger escapade, readers were treated to a serious supernatural expose. It's like getting casserole recipes in Popular Mechanics. It doesn't make any sense. This time, however, readers were dumbfounded by Doyle.
Like, that does not look real to your eyes, does it? Like, no sane person would think that that looks real at all. Like, those fairies are clearly not in the same place as that person in that photograph. And that person in that photograph clearly doesn't seem to notice them. I don't know if they're supposed to be, like, invisible or something to her. Maybe she doesn't realize they're there. I don't remember the exact story. But, like, since we have, like, stuff like Photoshop, like, very much normalized to us, we can see the problem with this picture. But maybe just his eyes could not handle it. It was just so challenging to him. He didn't get it.
Doyle's fairy hunt. How on earth could the creator of the world's greatest detective believe in such supernatural nonsense? What was he thinking? To Doyle, the story made sense. Never one to shy away from an investigation, he applied his intelligence to a unique case.
So this is kind of a larger lesson that very smart people can believe some dumb things. If you're smart enough, you can convince yourself of anything, really. Because you can find very fun, creative, intellectually interesting justifications for just about anything. Like, I think the smarter you are, the more capacity you have to believe ridiculous things in a lot of ways. I guess it's more the question of, like, how grounded are you? So some people are really intelligent, but they're not, like, super grounded.
While Strand readers may have thought Doyle had a screw loose, it was actually quite the opposite. Doyle wasn't shy about writing about his beliefs in fairies and spirits. When he first heard of the news of the Cottingley fairy photographs, he decided to dig a little deeper. He began by reaching out to experts at the George Eastman Kodak Company. After examining each of the first 2 fairy photos, the experts came to a consensus. There was no evidence of photo doctoring. Their discovery came with one caveat, however. While there was no evidence of photo manipulation, the experts insisted someone who knew enough about photography would be able to fake the pictures. But the pictures were, in fact, faked. And that was years before Photoshop was even a gleam in some developer's eye. Following his discussion with the experts at Eastman Kodak, Doyle made a decision. He felt the 2 Yorkshire village girls who took the fairy photos couldn't possibly have faked them. Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths were working-class girls whom Doyle felt lacked the skill to do so. He wrote, "I argued that we had certainly traced the pictures to 2 children of the artisan working class, and that such tricks would be entirely beyond them. Such short-sightedness does not make a good detective, but it didn't stop Doyle from continuing his investigation." After ruling out Wright and Griffith,
This is like a perfect opportunity to apply Occam's razor. Occam's razor, in its simplest explanation, is like, well, the simplest explanation is often the right one. And this is like a failure to use Occam's razor. This is like, what's more likely? That they photographed literal fairies, or that these girls somehow found a way to fake these pictures? And they decided it was so ridiculous that working class girls could manage to fake this that they were willing to put fairies, literal fairies, at the forefront of like possible explanations for this image, which is absolutely insane. It's definitely a failure to effectively use Occam's razor, but it's also like a clear case of working backwards from the conclusion. Like, I think they want this picture to be real, and they're trying to justify why it has to be real because these kids couldn't have done that.
As possible photo manipulators, Doyle went straight to the source of the fairy photo shoot. He sent someone on his behalf. Enlisting the aid of one Edward Gardner, he wanted to investigate the scene itself. An ardent believer in fairies himself, he wrote to Wright's mother in an attempt to convince her to take more photos.
They definitely look like paper.
Wrote, "I know quite well that fairies exist and that they are very shy of showing themselves or approaching adults. And it is only when one can obtain the help of their friends that one can hope to obtain photographs, and hence lead to a better understanding of nature's ways than is possible otherwise." Gardner had already spoken with several people who told him the girls often played with fairies and elves. When he finally arrived in Cottingley, he didn't suspect there was anything strange about the photographs at all. As Gardner interviewed Elsie Wright's parents, he received nothing but genuine responses. Her parents had no idea whether or not the photos were fake. They told Gardner about the origin of the photos. Surprisingly enough, it did not involve a hidden fountain or playing some kind of flute. Elsie took her father's camera to a small valley behind her cousin Frances's house. While there, she took a few pictures in an area where Frances was convinced she'd seen fairies. Afterward, they took the negative to Elsie's home, where her father developed it in his darkroom. The result was the first fairy photo that eventually caught Arthur Conan Doyle's attention in the first place. But it was all based on some artwork and artistic cutouts.
Literal paper! Literal paper.
Photography was not a new hobby for Elsie. She desired to be an artist for some time. She regularly painted watercolor fairies. Then she'd stick them to hat pins or arrange them in the yard. Though she had...
So if somebody finds fairies and then you find out they had a pre-existing interest in fairies, be suspicious. If somebody finds ghosts and you find they have a pre-existing interest in finding ghosts, be suspicious. It just so happened to happen to somebody who already had like a deep interest in fairies.
Had considerable talent, and Gardner saw her watercolors on display. He reasoned she didn't quite have the skills to draw the fairies seen in the photos. You can see where this is going. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, believed Gardner's assertion. He praised Elsie's family for their honesty and simplicity, and told Doyle he was convinced the photographs were 100% genuine. For his part, Gardner appreciated the opportunity to interview Elsie in person. She described the fairies' colors as the palest of green, pink, mauve, and showed him the exact spot where she snapped the pictures. She also shed some light on the gnome from the second photo, telling him the markings on the gnome's wings were actually musical pipes. She further explained that one could hear their faint high music on a still day. When Elsie Wright took the first Cottingley fairy photograph,
so funny.
She did so using a complicated old-fashioned camera. The result was a strange, haunting image, the likes of which most folks rarely see. So of course, Gardner asked Elsie's parents to have her take a few more photos. Elsie refused, citing the requirement for Frances to be present. Having moved to Scarborough recently, that simply wasn't going to happen. But Gardner wouldn't let it go. He convinced Frances's parents to allow her to spend a portion of the summer in Cottingley. That dude really wanted some fairy photos. With the heat on to produce new fairy pictures, Frances and Elsie concocted a plan. When the two girls were alone, they came up with a plan to fool Gardner. Elsie prepared 2 additional cutout fairies, placing them in the valley behind Frances's former home. Basing their illustrations and cutout figures on Alfred Noyes' A Spell for a Fairy, they were prepared to put their plan into action. They took 2 more fairy photographs and another picture of the area. After that, they swore...
And like, if somebody found the existing pictures of fairies among them, that's really all it would take here. I don't know how popular the images that they're using are.
Or to never take another fairy photo again in their lives. Gardner, for his part, was thrilled at the reception of the 2 new fairy photographs. But he was more enamored with the third photo, the one Elsie didn't fake. It showed a small sampling of the area's foliage, including a bird's nest, rainwater, and a few stray shadows. So of course, Gardner believed he saw fairies in that photo
You can see
too.
fairies if
And
you look
then
hard enough.
Things got a little weird. With Gardner's help, Doyle doubled down on asserting the fairies were, in fact, real. In March of 1921, Strand published a new piece, The Evidence for Fairies by A. Conan Doyle, with new fairy photographs. Doyle spent a significant part of the article praising Gardner's investigation and geeking out over the new fairy photo. He called it a fairy bower. Whatever that's supposed to mean, it's evident he wasn't referring to the Australian beach of the same name. The piece also included a new quote from Gardner, stating, "We have now succeeded in bringing this printout splendidly."
And Doyle doesn't necessarily take being wrong all that gracefully, and I don't think it really ever convinces him like that he should be more cautious in what beliefs he loudly ends up supporting. You would think it would make him a bit more humble. I never got the sense that Doyle was the most humble dude.
In 1922, Hodder and Stoughton Limited published a new Arthur Conan Doyle book, The Coming of the Fairies. It combined the two Strand articles and Doyle's optimistic belief that the existence of fairies would prove that other invisible beings interacted with our world. He believed it would take time for everyone else to see it his way. He wrote, "There is nothing scientifically impossible, so far as I can see, in some people seeing things that are invisible to others. Victorian science would have left the world hard and clean and bare, like a landscape in the moon. The experiences of children will be taken more seriously. Cameras will be forthcoming. Other well-authenticated cases will come along. These little folk who appear to be our neighbors, with only some small difference of vibration to separate us, will become familiar." Well, at least he was right about cameras. As for the fairies, it remains to be seen. But a man can dream. While we now know the true nature of the photos, Doyle never knew they were faked. Elsie and Francis deliberately
he didn't
chose
know
not
this
to
one.
reveal.
Okay, he's been proven wrong on like some stuff regarding to, well, I would say proven wrong. He's been made the fool in regards to spiritualism. I didn't know he never found out about these fairies. Oh gosh, only that would have broken his little heart.
The secret of their photographs until long after Doyle's passing. Part of their reasoning was to spare him any embarrassment. Elsie had seen him skewered in magazine cartoons and knew he desperately wanted to believe in the existence of the fairies. The secret of the illustrated fairy cutouts and their unique placing in the photographs certainly fooled Gardner and Doyle. Even after a candle company, Price & Sons, published a notice that the fairies in the photos were identical to the ones they used in their advertisements.
There we
It didn't faze them
go.
one bit. In 1983, Elsie admitted to the public that the photos were a hoax, although her cousin Frances maintained the fairies seen in the fifth photo were genuine until the day she died. Arthur Conan Doyle was not the cold, rational, real-life parallel to his famous detective. His dedication to spiritualism, interest in seances, and his work pertaining to that field are often ignored by biographers and researchers alike, but they are vital parts of who he was in life. Doyle's belief in the Cottingley fairies, for better or for worse, serves to demonstrate an aspect of humanity we all experience at one time or another. And that's what dreams are all about. So what do you think?
I mean, it does say a lot about like the power of the will to believe something. We can all be skeptics until we find something that we desperately want to believe. Especially somebody like Arthur Conan Doyle, who's, in the case of spiritualism, he experienced great loss. He was thinking about his son. This had to be real. It had to be. He had to know that he'd be able to see his son again. It was a coping mechanism. The fairy stuff, I don't know what he was getting out of that necessarily. But yeah, I can understand why he would be. He would really do his best to reinforce the pre-existing belief. It's best that we don't work backwards from our conclusions. And it's not a good thing to do, but we can at least understand like the emotional toll that pushes somebody to believe something like this. I love that Holmes would have probably hated Doyle as much as Doyle hated him. Maybe. There are some places where you think like, oh, is Doyle inserting himself into his character? And it makes you think like, oh, does that come from a place of self-hatred sometimes? But like more or less, Holmes is not Doyle. It's mostly Watson that Doyle is. But there are some cases where I kind of, it feels like through the way that he writes, he does have some admiration for the character through what you see in Watson. But he seemed to hate it so much, like, outwardly, and I don't understand, like, I guess I just have trouble understanding him as a human being through a lot of his writing. It doesn't always tell you the exact thing you're trying to get out of him.